Chapter 11. Whispers of the Fallen. The knock at the orphanage door was firm, not demanding, but weighted with expectation. Lilla set aside the old book she had been reading and dusted off her hands before answering. Outside, a small group of villagers stood together, their faces tight with concern. A few were parents, others simple townsfolk, but they all carried the same nervous energy. One of the men cleared his throat. "Lilla, we need to talk." She nodded, stepping aside to let them in. Something was wrong. Inside, they gathered in the main room, shifting uncomfortably. It was a familiar sight, worried parents hesitant to speak their minds, fearful of stepping too far, yet unable to keep silent. It was a woman who spoke first. "It's about what the children are saying at the schoolhouse." Lilla frowned. "What do you mean?" Another man stepped forward, his voice a mix of frustration and unease. "They've been talking about the fallen gods," she exhaled slowly. "And?" The woman wrung her hands. "Lilla, you must understand, these are things best left unsaid, names that have not been spoken in centuries. If the gods hear—" "If they hear what?" Lilla interrupted, her voice steady. "The truth?" A heavy silence filled the room. One of the older men sighed. "It's not about truth, it's about peace. People live their lives without needing to think of those who fell from grace. And so we do not need that kind of trouble here." Lilla folded her arms. "I have never told the children to worship them. I have only taught them history, the past as it happened. Some things are better forgotten." She shook her head. "And yet here you all are, remembering." The argument stretched on, turning in circles, fear against reason, silence against knowledge. And then the door creaked open. The children had returned from the village school. They stood quietly in the doorway, eyes wide. They had heard everything. Dietro, always the first to speak, stepped forward. "Lilla, why don't they want us to learn?" The villagers shifted, some looking away. Lilla sighed, kneeling down to meet the boy's gaze. "Because people fear what they do not understand." Nika furrowed her brows. "But we're just learning. How can that be bad?" Chiron, quieter but always thoughtful, glanced at the villagers. "Are the gods angry?" The woman from before hesitated, then shook her head. "Not yet, but they might be." The weight of that might hung in the air. Lilla stood, placing a hand on Dietro's shoulder. "No knowledge is dangerous on its own, only what people do with it." A tense silence followed. Finally, the villagers began to file out, murmuring among themselves. As the door closed behind them, Kashua clenched her fists. "That's not fair." Lilla exhaled, rubbing her temples. "No, it isn't." But fairness had never mattered to the gods. Lilla sat on the edge of the wooden table, her gaze sweeping over the children as they settled onto the chairs and floor around her. She could see the weight of the conversation pressing down on them, their young minds wrestling with questions most adults never dared to ask. She folded her hands in her lap. "Now that you've heard everything, tell me, what do you think is the right choice?" The room was silent at first. The crackle of the hearth fire filled the space, a slow rhythm against the ticking of the old clock. Then Dietro, the boldest among them, spoke. I think it's unfair," he said, arms crossed. "They act like we're doing something bad just by knowing things." "They're scared," Chiron murmured, his round face deep in thought. "Not just of what we know, but of what could happen because we know it." "But does that mean we should stop learning?" Nika asked, her sharp eyes flicking between them all. "If we don't ask questions, then we're just—" She hesitated, trying to find the right words. "Blind," Kashua finished for her. "And if we're blind, then we won't know when we're in danger," Lilla nodded, slowly. "But what if knowing puts you in danger?" That made them stop. Ollie, the tallest of them, fidgeted with his sleeves. "Maybe it's like a blade," he said finally. "A sword can protect you, but it can also hurt you, even if you're careful." Argia, who had been quiet until now, whispered, "But if you don't know how to use it, you can't protect yourself at all." The thought lingered in the air. Lilla tilted her head. "So what's the answer? Do you take up the sword, knowing you could cut yourself? Or do you leave it behind and hope you'll never need it?" Kashua clenched her fists. "I want to know, even if it's dangerous." Chiron sighed. "I do too, but it's hard. What if something bad happens because we learn something we shouldn't? That's what they want us to believe," Dietro muttered. "That knowing is bad." "But knowing isn't bad," Nika shot back. "Only what we do with it." Lilla smiled softly. A wise thought, but knowledge does have consequences, no matter how you use it. There was another pause. Then Ollie sat up straighter. I think, he hesitated, then nodded to himself. I think it should be our choice. No one should be forced to learn, but no one should be forced not to either. Argia looked up at Lila. Is that possible? Lila's expression turned distant. I don't know. She looked at them, these children who had no idea how much they reminded her of the past, of Arcadia, of a time when questions like these had led to monuments of progress and terrible destruction. She stood, dusting off her skirt. Perhaps the right choice isn't something I can give you. It's something you must decide every day as you grow. The children glanced at each other, still unsure but thoughtful. Lila smiled. That was enough for now. Lila sighed as she walked the familiar path to the schoolhouse, her boots crunching against the dirt road. She had known this would happen eventually. The other children had been wary of Arcadia's legacy for a while now, but it seemed things had finally reached their boiling point. Dietro had always been the most passionate, the most stubborn. She wasn't surprised he had thrown a punch, only that it had taken this long. When she arrived, she found Dietro sitting outside on the steps, arms crossed, a bruise forming on his cheek. The schoolmaster, a wiry man with thinning hair, stood nearby, watching her with a mixture of expectation and mild disapproval. He's your responsibility, the schoolmaster said stiffly. I won't tolerate this kind of behaviour, Lila, not from your children or anyone else's. Lila gave him a calm, unreadable look before crouching down in front of Dietro. What happened? Dietro scowled. He called you a witch, he muttered. Said you were filling our heads with evil ideas. Said that Melania and Arceus were just false gods and that the walking city was a curse. His fists clenched. So I punched him, Lila sighed. And what did I tell you about solving problems with your fists? Dietro hesitated but finally mumbled, That I shouldn't, Lila nodded. But sometimes people deserve it. The schoolmaster made a noise of disapproval, but Lila only gave Dietro a tired smile. She couldn't say she disagreed. Still, she placed a firm hand on his shoulder. I know it's hard. I know it hurts to hear them say those things, but fighting won't change their minds. It'll only make them more certain they're right. Dietro looked down, still fuming. So what? We just let them say whatever they want? No, Lila said gently, but there are better ways to fight than with your fists. Dietro frowned but didn't argue. He knew she was right, even if he hated it. She sighed and stood, offering him her hand. Come on, let's go home. As they walked, she glanced at him. You care a lot about this, don't you? Dietro hesitated before nodding. It's not fair. Just because they don't understand doesn't mean they get to treat us like we're bad people. Lila hummed in agreement. Prejudice comes from fear, and fear comes from ignorance. Dietro kicked a rock along the road. Then how do we make them stop being afraid? Lila smiled, though there was something sad in her eyes. By proving them wrong. Lila guided Dietro back to the orphanage, the two walking in silence for a while as the weight of the conversation lingered in the air. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the fields as they approached the familiar cottage. Once inside, the other children were finishing their chores, their voices a low hum in the background. Lila sat down at the small wooden table and motioned for Dietro to join her. He did so reluctantly, still fuming from the incident earlier, but he was listening. I know you're angry, Lila began, her voice soft but firm. And I understand why. The city, the gods, everything. It's not easy to make sense of, but there's something important you need to know. Dietro crossed his arms. What? Like what happened to Arceus? What happened to everything? Lila nodded, her expression becoming more somber. After the fall of Arcadia, things changed for many of the gods. Arceus, she was sealed away. You see, Arceus was not like the other deities. She was born from the Creator's design, not as a natural force of nature or an ancient power, but something new, something artificial. And when the city fell, when things turned chaotic, the gods became divided. She paused, thinking back to those difficult times. Some feared Arceus's power. Her connection to the Creator was too close. She became too dangerous in their eyes, and so she was sealed away in the depths of Elysium, hidden from the world until the time was right for her return. Dietro's eyes narrowed. So she's just stuck, and the Creator's going to come get her? Yes, Lila said quietly. Arceus isn't gone. She's waiting. She's waiting for the right time, and when that time comes, the Creator will free her. I'm sure of it. Dietro looked down at his hands. But if she's not dead, why hasn't anyone tried to get her back? Why didn't anyone go after her? Lila sighed, the weight of the question settling in her chest. Some gods didn't believe in Arceus. Some didn't trust her. Others feared what she could do if she was freed, and some believed that the world had no place for a goddess of technology anymore. But that's not true. The world still needs her. The Creator knows that. She leaned forward, her voice becoming more urgent. I know it's hard to see that now with everything that's happened, but Arceus was never a false god. She was a creation, just like you and me, trying to understand her place in this world. And one day she will come back. Dietro met her gaze, his frustration replaced by a flicker of curiosity. But how do we know when it's the right time? How do we know when she'll come back? Lila smiled softly, her heart heavy but hopeful. That's the thing about time, Dietro. We never really know, but we must trust that the Creator will come for her when the world is ready, and when that day comes, the people who are ready will see it, just like you and I will. She leaned back in her chair, letting the silence hang between them for a moment before she added, Arceus will not be forgotten, not by those who know what she really means. Dietro took a deep breath, his fists unclenching. I guess it's okay then. If she's waiting for the right time, then maybe we have to wait too. Exactly, Lila said, her voice soft but full of conviction. Sometimes the world moves in ways we don't understand, but that doesn't mean we stop believing in what's right. As the evening drew on, Lila and Dietro sat in silence, the flickering candlelight casting soft shadows around the room. The weight of the world outside seemed a little lighter in the warmth of their home, and for the first time that day, Dietro's shoulders seemed to relax.